Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker and helping if you're scared of many things. So this was actually rather a positive story that very sadly the BBC has run as if it was negative and made it seem scary. So I'm doing this to hopefully quickly help fact check it for people who might be getting scared by it tonight. And the BBC has so often been so misleading in the things it said and falsely said things that are positive as if they were scary. So the positive thing here is that actually Viktor Orban told Trump his ideas for ways to end the war, and that Trump and Viktor Orban both said that they think the war can end quite soon. So that the only thing here is that it's a mild positive, slight positive, is what it should have been reported as, and lots of good things here. So I'll go. But instead, the BBC is very inaccurate, and they have suggested that Zelensky was opposed to the exemption that Trump granted to Hungary, when Zelensky said nothing of the sort. He said nothing even remotely like that. And they did that by taking something Zelensky said completely out of context. They took a speech where Zelensky never once mentioned Viktor Orban or Hungary, and they took one sentence out of that speech and they presented it as if it was him objecting to the whole exemption for Hungary, when he never said any such thing. So this was very twisted, that's what spiral means, and extremely misleading. And they also omitted lots of very good positive things, so they're very serious omissions. So let's go and look at it. So first of all, look at how Kiev Independent ran the story. So that's the Ukrainian point of view. That US granted Hungary an exemption, which is true. Trump explained it's difficult for Orban to get oil and gas because they don't have any seaports. True. That they expect the war to end soon. Both said they expect the war to end soon, with Orban saying privately presented plans to Trump for ways to end the war, which is true. That Zelensky said back in October he welcomes any summit in Hungary if it helps to end the war sooner, which is true. So that is me summarising. I will actually go to their page and I'll show you where they say all these things. So that US granted an exemption from sanctions on Russian oil and gas, which is true, and they didn't say anything about Zelensky objecting to that, because he didn't object to that. And they say that, sure, we're looking at it because it's very difficult for Orban to get oil and gas from other areas. And they just present that as what he said, which is factually correct. So they had no commentary on that. They then say, Trump said, I think we agree that the war is going to end in the not too distant future. He said that to Orban, and Orban added that he has some ideas to present to Trump about how to make sure that happens. And that again, that was not mentioned by the BBC. And then that back in October, if there's a meeting that can generally lead to a ceasefire and end to the war, Ukraine will support any such format. And that is what Zelensky said. So you can see that my summary of what the Kiev Independent reported is accurate. I hope you can agree that I've made an accurate summary of what they said there. So now let's go back to what the BBC said and how they put it. So, oh yes, the BBC said, sorry, that should say the word false there. I need to correct that. Just there, where you see that dot emission should be actually the exports. So BBC said that the president gave them this 1 year exemption, which is true, something which did not go down well in Kiev. That is completely false. And so I will give you the quote that the BBC took out of context. So before I get to this, I need to give a little bit of introduction. Zelensky's viewers know that Zelensky wants an immediate ceasefire because he's talking in Ukrainian to Ukrainians. And he's been saying that for the last year. And they want a ceasefire along the current lines. And everyone in Ukraine who hears his daily broadcasts in Ukrainian know that Zelensky is asking for an immediate ceasefire along the current lines. And They know that all the sanctions and pressure on Russia will stop as soon as Putin stops fighting. So all sanctions are just to stop him, to get Putin to stop fighting. And this is very important because many people in Ukraine are Russian speaking as their first language. Zelensky is Russian speaking as their first language. They have nothing against Russian civilians. The Ukraine and Russia are very close in many ways. Indeed, Zelensky, when he was a comedian in Ukraine and Russia. And he competed in comedy contests in Russia. That's an example of how close the two countries are. And they are not opposed to Russian people. And I'll just do this very quickly, just a few seconds on this. That for example, when Zelensky was elected president with a landslide, then the Donbass regions in the first round, they voted for a pro-Russian party, in a very pro-Russian party in the Ukrainian government. But they all then switched to Zelensky in the second round. And the leader of that party, as soon as Putin invaded Ukraine, and he was totally opposed to the invasion. And this is the pro-Russia party, the most strongly pro-Russian party in the Ukrainian government, is completely opposed to the Putin invasion. And he actually the leader himself joined the Home Guard defense and had urged his followers to help defend against Putin. So this is, but even the most pro-Russian people in the Ukrainian Guard parliament, they support stopping Putin from invading Ukraine. Naturally, who would like being bombed by Putin? So that is the background here. So he doesn't need to explain this to them. They know that. They know that he is supportive of the Russian people. So he says here, pressure on Russia is still insufficient. Any weakening within already existing formats of pressure only encourages Putin to prolong the war. This is what the BBC took out of context. And then he goes on, and this is a bit of hyperbole. The people will know but we want so many sanctions, so much pressure, so much support for life that Russia is stripped of all means of existence in wartime. It does not mean that he wants the Russian people to starve. He's talking about the Russian government there. He wants the Russian government to be forced to stop the war. And so, sadly, he was using a bit of hyperbole there, but the people who were listening to him would understand perfectly well what he really meant. And his objective in reality is to persuade Putin to a ceasefire and that all the sanctions stop, and Russians will benefit greatly from this, as do the Ukrainians, when the war ends. So now back to what the BBC said. So it came only hours after, first there were strikes on Ukraine, only hours after Donald Trump met Orban, and that is true. But it's not true. What is not explained properly is that this happened frequently, and there are numerous strikes on Ukraine, and they already were having rolling blackouts because of all the strikes on their power stations before this happened. And then the president gave him a 1-year exemption from US sanctions against buying oil and gas in Russia, and that's true. And then he said something which did not go down well in Kiev. That's completely false. They provided no evidence for that. There's none of the other mainstream news that I've checked, and I checked a very wide range. Even TASS doesn't say that. Nobody in the full range of everything that I've followed, TASS, the BBC, the Russian propaganda, they don't say that. It's an invention by the BBC. And they say there's not pressure to any weakness in response to, so this is the quote, which is slightly different translation that they had in it, but it was taken completely misleading out of context. It was not about Viktor Orban at all. And it's just a thing he said often. Then a war that for some came very close at home, this was misleading, taken out of context. It didn't provide the context that this happened several times a week, and that Ukraine already had power cuts because of the previous strikes. And then they go on to say, and now this is extraordinarily misleading and very twisted. The BBC said that if Russia can continue to sell oil to Hungary, They can use the money earned to build more drones and more missiles, just like those that flew through the skies of Ukraine last night. Nobody of the experts that I follow ever say that the aim of the sanctions is to reduce the number of missiles. They would not have that effect. Indeed, that is false. It's just not true. I should have a false thing as well. Twisted, misleading and false. Because the oil revenue... Now, when Ukraine hits the oil refineries, and it's possible that the correspondent there was a little bit confused with that, I don't know. When Ukraine hits the oil refineries, that then cuts off the supply of fuel to the war, which reduces the number of missiles. So the oil refineries, because they produce refined oil, which is then used to supply the war machine, especially if they hit the oil refineries near to Ukraine, then that does directly affect the missiles and the ability to fire missiles at Ukraine. But selling oil does not. That is a very different thing. This is crude oil that Russia is selling to other countries, not oil that it's using itself. The funding from that funds the Russian government, which Russia then uses for everything. So just reducing the funding on the Russian government for the rest, for the whole of Russia. So, Hungary's 2.2% of the oil revenue is not going to do anything to the number of missiles that hit Ukraine. It's an utterly ridiculous claim to make. What was he even thinking? Was his mind even engaged when the correspondent said that? Was he just using words because the words sounded impressive without even thinking about what he was saying? It just doesn't make sense at all. So the idea behind the oil sanctions is that the oil sanctions will cut a big hole in the government funding, and the government is earning more from the oil than it's spending on this extremely expensive war. So if the oil sanctions work and effective, then there'll be just a big hole in the government budget for Russia, equal to the expense of the war. And Putin can obviously plug that hole by simply stopping the war, so he doesn't spend so much money on it. He can also, if he stops the war, he'll get all the oil funding again. So he'll get a double bonus if he stops the war. No longer all the expense from the war, and getting oil funding as well, if he stops. And the idea is not that the oil sanctions would immediately stop the war, because they can't, because Russia has pots of money that they can use that could fund the war certainly to the end of this year, even if the oil funding stopped just now. So rather it is the idea that if the oil sales completely stop, then Putin, all the people around him will be grumbling to him, saying, look, our reserves our internal reserves, not the foreign reserves that are already frozen, but what they've got internally, they're saying that this is just going down, 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 down. Why are you doing this? This very expensive war, and we've got very little in reserve now if we need it for something, and this is just going down and down. And so at some point over the next several months, Putin would hopefully stop the war. But he wouldn't have any direct effect on the missiles whatsoever. He would still be firing as many missiles as he can make until he stops the war. So you can see it's an extremely, extremely, extremely misleading. And then, so the oil revenue funds the government. The government uses the funding for many things. The idea is that by cutting off the oil revenue, it puts extra pressure on Putin to stop the war, because he'll start getting internal pressure from other people in the Kremlin saying, look, we've got this big hole in our government finances, so we must stop the war. And for the many experts, this thing that the BBC said is not said by anyone. I've never seen anyone say that in any reputable source, that the oil revenue has any direct effect on the number of missiles, because it doesn't. So now I just want to talk about Hungary's role in all this. Is absolutely minimal. It's only 2.2% of the Russian oil exports. And if you look at this, these are the top countries for coal, crude oil, liquid natural gas, oil products, pipeline gas. Hungary doesn't appear in any of those. So it's not, there's no reason for Zelensky to be opposed to this. It's not significant. Zelensky has talked often about China and India, but he doesn't talk about Hungary, not in this sense. He doesn't make a big thing about this at all. And now this explains why it is difficult for Hungary. So here's Hungary, completely landlocked, and it gets its oil from Slovakia, mainly. So it gets most of its oil from Russia, obviously. So that's the coming from Russia. But it gets a certain amount of oil from Slovakia overland from the sea, and it gets some other oil by these other routes. It can get some oil that way. I don't know if it does. I'm not sure about that. It gets most of its oil comes from this pipeline from Slovakia, of the oil that it doesn't get from Russia. The mainly 14% or whatever it is. But Hungary says that Slovakia has the pipeline, it just doesn't have the capacity to take over from the oil it is getting from Russia. Now this is somewhat disputed. Slovakia says that if only Hungary would pay it, that it can deliver enough oil through this pipeline. It's never actually done it, but it says that theoretically it can do it. Hungary doesn't believe that the pipeline will be able to transmit this volume of oil, and Hungary also objects that Slovakia is putting a premium because of Hungary's difficult position. So that is the actual truth behind this dispute. So it's not actually completely clear whether Slovakia could deliver the amount of oil that it claims it can deliver through the pipeline. It claims that it's got new technology and new methods that reduces the friction through the pipeline, which it says would enable it to deliver enough oil to Hungary. It's not actually proven that in practice, because Hungary is not buying the oil, because Hungary doesn't believe this. And Hungary also says that Slovakia is charging it too much. So that is the actual details behind this dispute. And Ukraine is simply not stepping in on that. Zelensky isn't commenting on that. And to Putin, Trump has given Hungary a year. So it's just a 1-year exemption. It's not an indefinite exemption. Hopefully the war is over well before a year from now. But it's got a year to transition away from Russian oil, and that's quite reasonable given its difficult situation. So I hope you now understand how very misleading this story is. And Russia is not going to attack Ukraine. I mean, I've been through all this before. It's got a vast overmatch. It's not going to attack NATO. NATO's got a vast overmatch. So I've been through all that before. Now I've got no risk of world war. We're going in the opposite direction. So anyway, I hope that helps you to be much less scared and have a better understanding of the true situation, and to dispel the huge number of myths. So just to go back to the top of the page, then, so these symbols I think are very appropriate. It's very twisted, extremely misleading, and major omissions. And this is what the BBC News story sadly has been like today. And I just want to say that BBC has done a number of such stories. An extremely misleading story in November, just about a year ago today. It would be around about this time last year. It's another extremely misleading story with as much wrong with it as this. And I went through the BBC complaints process. It took them a year to process my complaint. Normally it's just a few weeks, but for mine it took nearly a year. And all they said is, at the end of that process, all they said is that the journalist is an experienced journalist, so therefore I shouldn't complain. What's the point in the complaints process if you can't complain? Because when the journalist is an experienced journalist, which of course all the BBC ones are, but these experienced journalists are not telling you the truth. So I'm going to take that to Ofcom as soon as I get a moment or two to do it, to this story from last year. I could equally do this story, but this story then be a year from now before I complete the process. if they are as slow as they were with me for the previous story that I objected to. But they do numerous stories like this. It's just, I have some hope that Ofcom, because they are generally independent of the BBC, got a very strong case for this previous story. I think there's some possibility that Ofcom might support my case, although it's only a fraction of a % of all cases that come to them that they actually do support. So anyway, fingers crossed. Hope that maybe this attempt at taking another very misleading story to Ofcom actually works this time, and they actually do something. So that's another maybe possibility. But this is an example of how extremely twisted the headlines sometimes are. And just to say, the reason they do all this is because the twisted headlines get people to click and watch. And with this nowadays, it's not just the story that you see people watching it on TV. You get these video clips from the BBC that they then go on YouTube, and then those YouTube videos then get shared widely, and then you get these stories running about in little clips being shared on social media, and the story running for weeks or months even sometimes in social media, and that's why they do it. They do it to get attention, not because it's true. And this one is extremely false. I wouldn't be surprised if this runs for a few weeks in social media as clips, but it's just not true at all.